I'm delighted to be here representing Mount Vernon, where I work as the head of the new Presidential Library and Center for the Study of George Washington there. Last year, we had a fantastic event when Lafayette's ship L'Hermione was right out in the Potomac. You could see it from the lawn at Mount Vernon, and it was a great occasion with a conference as well that went with it. And it strikes me that these sorts of remembrances of America's long tie to France and to Europe is so crucial in the moment itself. What better way to try to create fellowship in today's world than reminding everyone of the common history that we all share. Our panel is on winning the peace, the negotiation of the Treaty of Paris. 1783 in Paris was known as the Year of Miracles. It was the year when George Washington did resign his commission and return to Mount Vernon and was called, as Andrew O'Shaughnessy mentioned earlier, by George III, the greatest man in the world for doing that. It was also a year where Paris was obsessed with balloon flights. And the French at that time were able to show humankind that the barriers of the earth could be broken. And these few Frenchmen who were drinking wine 400 meters in the air above Paris was the talk of the town. There's a famous French newsletter which mentioned that if you don't want to speak about the balloon adventures, then we don't want to speak with you as well. So it was central to that notion of a miraculous year. And crucial to that was this American treaty, which was considered to be outside of all expectations in terms of its success. Here were these American rubes who had somehow negotiated a treaty which had granted them massive amounts of land in North America, the rights of the fishery, their independence, all these things that were beyond expectations. And so it was a year in which things seemed possible that hadn't been possible before. And in some ways, you know, as the ambassador pointed out, of course, in the broader framing of what was at stake for the French ministry, the independence of the United States, this puny little provincial new country in North America, might not have been much of anything, but as an experiment in Republican government, like the experiments of the balloon launches, it really helped people transform their expectations of what the world would become, and very soon after, of course, would transform the geopolitics of the Western Hemisphere. It was possible in large part because of the generosity of vision of the British minister, the Earl of Shelburne, who we'll hear about later, who was prime minister by the middle of 1782 after the prime minister died of the flu. And he had a vision of an American mercantile power that would be a great consumer of British goods, was willing to go with the boundaries that had been offered. It was also possible because the American ministers broke the rules that they'd been given by Congress. They broke their promises that they'd made to the French in the Treaty of 1778 not to form a separate peace or negotiation with the British without French oversight. This was largely due to the arrival of John Jay on the scene, the first Supreme Court justice who had been suffering for years in Spain, trying to get recognition from Spain, marching from court to court, and was adamant not to trust the French when he arrived in Paris, despite being descended with Huguenots. John Jay, of course, was a lawyer, and with that ability to fight over the detail, he was able to wrest many concessions. But it was also due to Franklin. Although Franklin opposed this move to work against Vergennes and work without his oversight, to work against the instructions of the US Congress. In fact, as late as the fall of 1782, Franklin was talking about forming a new treaty of alliance with multiple European powers to make sure that the British could be kept in check after the war would be ended. But Franklin had really negotiated the crucial contract with the French ministry about the settlement of American debt that would be fundamental, that would allow the Americans to negotiate without French oversight. The French, by this point, had lent something in the nature of 34 million livres to the American cause, and the promise was that they wouldn't have to pay until 3 years after peace was signed, something that was crucial to allow the American ministers to believe that they could go it alone in the negotiation. But the great coup of Franklin in this moment, despite the fact that he lost out amongst his fellow ambassadors, was he was able to convince the French that they really had done nothing wrong. What could you expect from a bunch of rube Americans who came in here? Isn't this delightful, Vergennes, that this was able to happen? And even convinced them to send another 3 million livres on the same ship that sent the preliminary negotiations to America. So it's an extraordinary achievement of diplomacy due to the generosity of the French and also to the generous vision of the British in that moment. Our panel is going to discuss this more at length, and we're going to do something that we haven't done today, really, is we're going to combine a historian of the period with a practitioner of diplomacy and high strategy of our own contemporary times. So allow me, first of all, to introduce David Hancock, who's going to give our first comment. David Hancock is a professor at the University of Michigan. He's also director of the Atlantic Studies Initiative. He's written a book called Citizens of the World, London Merchants and the Integration of the British Atlantic, and also a fantastic study called Oceans of Wine, Madeira and the Emergence of American Trade, Atlantic Trade, and Taste. He is what I would describe as a scholar. He admonishes us to work harder, to learn more languages, to do more research, to write great books. But he's one of those scholars who actually can speak to a broad and general public. So I think we're really going to learn quite a bit about the details behind the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris. Please welcome David Hancock.
Thank you for that very kind introduction and the opportunity to meet with you today. It's a real pleasure to talk to you about the subject of winning the peace, negotiating the treaty. But it's a kind of double pleasure for me. I actually began my career working on a book about London's Atlantic merchants, as Doug just said, one of whom was Richard Oswald. Oswald was Britain's negotiator for peace in 1782-83, and if you looked closely at the copy of the State Department painting outside in the hallway, you realize he's the only negotiator who's now represented in Benjamin West's famous painting of the peacemakers. Currently, I'm finishing a biography of the Irish-born Prime Minister, the second Earl of Shelburne, who, although he almost single-handedly crafted Britain's peace with America and the other belligerents, he was, like Oswald, not present in September '83, or not even much acknowledged at the signing of the definitive treaty, because he had been ousted 6 months before in a storm of parliamentary dissatisfaction over the terms of the peace. Maybe this says something about my penchant for writing about subjects that are lost to history, but equally it's the story of the peace itself, I think. It's a story in which many of the parts have been lost to us. Surprisingly, one of these parts is the role that France plays, not in the general winning of the war, but the role that France plays in the construction of the peace between Britain and America. So that's what I'll talk about today. This piece is often described, just for a snapshot of historiography, it's often described as a case of Britain caving into America. Britain gave away so much, the story goes, because America had won the war, and as the interpretation goes, America had more wily and more moral negotiators at the table. Conversely, in this story, Britain had lost the war. Britain was financially and psychologically exhausted, and Britain had administrators and negotiators who were weak, easily duped, or corrupt. Very often they were all three, according to these historians. Now that narrative is driven in part by triumphalist American historians who are writing their own victors' account of the war period, and it's in part written by the defeatist British historians, who Andrew alluded to before, people who didn't want to much admit that they had lost, and they didn't see much to defend in the loss of so much men and land. except for the kind of coincidental or contemporary buildup of territorial empire in India and Asia. What I'd like to suggest today, though, is this. What's often been perceived simply as a case of Britain giving away so much so easily to America is a much rather more complicated story. It's a story that has as much to do, or has much to do with the British and the European personalities involved and their philosophies, and with Britain's need to factor into Europe into the peace. In American history, I teach in the American Revolution at the University of Michigan, we always talk about Britain and America, and we never talk about the other parts to the story. And that actually has pervaded much of what's been talked about today as well. So the big point is, more than America was on the mind of Britons when they craft the peace of 1782-83. France and Europe were just as important, I think, as America. And when they thought about France, when the Britons thought about France, it was not always as an opponent. I think we seem to pit Britain and France today as these people savagely engaged in some kind of zero-sum game, but that was not necessarily the case. Historians have looked at these negotiations in several ways. The imperial and the British historians have argued that peace was shaped by overseas or imperial and domestic developments. And in the big part of that story is that trade was preferred over territory, as exemplified in what they called the swing to the east, that supposedly recentered the British Empire in India and Asia. In contrast, the American historians have adopted a much more moralistic and patriotic perspective. For them, the peace was an unremitting moral and strategic win for clever, superior Americans and a total loss for unskilled, inferior Britons. Both sets of historians, British and American alike, and I'll accept one or two individuals, but both sets of historians have ignored what was really going on in Europe, Africa, and India. Both sets have neglected to factor the simultaneous negotiations and discussions with the French, Spanish, Dutch, and then the conversations with the Austrians and the Russians into the outcome. So what I'm saying is there's a third way to tell the story of this peace. You can paint it on a much larger canvas. And that's what I find fascinating with this British mastermind behind these treaties, Lord Shelburne, because I think his life, his career, and certainly the diplomacy in 1782-83 highlight the, if not a truly global nature of the peacemaking, then at least the reality of having to grapple with the turning of a cosmopolitan philosophy that he and many other diplomats shared into an actual program, and then maintaining the balance of power in Europe. Shelburne was one of the most influential leaders of the late 18th century Anglophone world. He's born in 1737 in Dublin. His family had been in Ireland since the 12th century, and they had been Catholic until the late 1600s. He's a wealthy aristocrat, probably one of the 10 wealthiest aristocrats in Britain at the time. He's a wealthy aristocrat who inherits vast estates in Ireland, England, and America. He's a military officer who had served with the British Army in France and Germany under Wolfe, and then later the Marquis of Granby in the late 1750s. He's also a politician. He briefly sits in the House of Commons in 1760 and 61 at the relatively young age of 24, and thereafter he serves in the House of Lords for the next 40 years. He's one of its great speechifiers. His speeches are almost Castro-like, and they could go on for 3 or 4 hours. But Shelburne holds high office at a very early age. After a few years in the Lords, he becomes the first Lord of Trade, the president of the Board of Trade. He becomes Secretary of State for the Southern Department in 1766 and through 68, which handled the American colonies as well as the European Department. He becomes the Secretary of State for Home Affairs in 1782. And then finally, luckily for him, Rockingham does die on July 1st, so he becomes Prime Minister and holds the post of Prime Minister for about 9 months. Now, he's an interesting intellectual figure. He's someone who's almost like Franklin and Voltaire kind of wrapped into one. Unfortunately for me, in writing the biography, he's written about as many letters as both of them together. He's an avid, informed improver. He tinkers not only with his soils and his crops on his English and his Irish estates, but he's also tinkers with the economic practices throughout all of Britain in an attempt to better not only his estates, but also his nation, the continent of Europe and empire. Moreover, Shelburne was a formidable intellectual figure who undertook to make the Euro-Atlantic, and I use that phrase, not just Anglo-Atlantic, the Euro-Atlantic community a model for world improvement by establishing a kind of cosmopolitan approach through which advances in science, society, and religion could be effected universally. He travels widely in Europe. We don't usually think of these British politicians. They go on the grand tour once, but they're not usually fully engaged. Shelburne was fully engaged. He travels widely in Europe throughout his life, first while serving as an officer in the 7 Years' War, and then he makes over a dozen long trips over the next 2 decades. The tour for him, he uses the word tour, but the tour for him is not a one-off grand event that you do when you're 18 or 17. But it was a lifelong learning process. And France for him was the center of his education. He collected and read books in 7 languages, amassing one of the largest, most influential private libraries in Britain. He speaks 4 of these languages fluently. He visited and corresponded indefatigably with the fellow intellectuals in Europe's capital, especially the French Enlightenment, as well as with like-minded souls farther afield in America and in Asia. He gathers around him, based on his experience in the French salon, he wants to replicate the salon in England. He gathers around him some of the era's greatest freethinkers, encouraging, imbibing, and promoting their work. And in particular, he evangelizes them about the belief in the unity of the Euro-American community. Now, several aspects of Shelburne's peacemaking need to be better appreciated, I think, and it's particularly germane to today's discussion. First of all, there's the personal dimension. In terms of temperament, this mastermind of the treaties, Shelburne was an inveterate compromiser, and so too were his closest friends and official appointees. The merchant and the slave trader Richard Oswald was certainly one of these compromisers, probably much more so than Shelburne. And Shelburne, on a number of occasions in the fall of '82, has to rein him in, and at one point brings in another diplomat to sort of oversee what's happening in Paris, because Oswald, who actually was a close and longtime friend of both Henry Lawrence and Franklin, certainly was on their page well before anyone in Whitehall was. Throughout Shelburne's long career as head of the Whig Party, Shelburne had shown that he was willing to change his mind on particular matters again and again and again when he was given more or different information. From the time he starts his career as aide-de-camp to George III in 1760, and then he goes on to manage appointments for the 3rd Earl of Bute in the early 60s. From that point, he's known as a kind of he's known as wishy-washy and a waverer, but it's really because he's a compromiser and compromises when he gets more information. That trait creates, of course, real difficulty for him, not surprisingly, but I think it's wrongly so. But it gives other people the impression that he believes in little but himself and the exercise of power. Granting independence, then, as a condition for treaty making was not something Shelburne really wanted. Shelburne had been on record since the late 70s, standing in the House of Lords saying we should not grant them independence. His patron Chatham had opposed not granting independence, but bringing them back into the British fold. Granting independence as a condition for treaty making was not something he wanted, but it was needed, he felt, by August and September of 1782 to bring the Americans back into his discussion, to put the Americans on his side rather than on the French side. He gave away a lot in the negotiations, but it turns out, if you look at it, not all that he could have. He doesn't agree to the cession of Canada, for example, to the States. He doesn't agree to free trade with France, although he's a firm believer in free trade. He doesn't agree to the giving away of Gibraltar. Still, compromise in his mind, is good, and it's good because it did one thing. It would minimize the past and the present rancor of the Americans. The Americans go into Paris sort of opposed in a way to the British. They come out of it siding with the British in many respects. So it would, this compromise would sort of encourage the future interaction between the English, the British, and the Americans. It would also have, in turn, the effect, and he was conscious of that, and he writes to Oswald about this in private correspondence, it would have the effect of putting pressure on the Europeans and on the French to promote a kind of greater harmony and balance in Europe. Now, in addition to him being a compromiser, in terms of inclination, Shelburne was something of a Francophile. Actually, he's an ardent Francophile, not something of a Francophile. He's enamored with French culture, and he's deeply conversant with French thought, so much so that he gets things 3 or 4 or 5 days after they're published in Paris. He travels to Europe every third year between 1760 and 1780. He stays each time from about 3 to 5 months. He corresponds with France's leading lights and leading politicians, whether he's in office or out of office. He believes in the eminence of French thought and applauds French politicians' programs. From the time of the first tutorials he took and readings courses he took at Christ Church, Oxford, from the time of his first visits to France during the winter campaigns of the 7 Years' War, through the darkest days of the French Revolution when it was not popular to be pro-French, he never wavered in his thinking that the French were not the kind of ne plus ultra in European thought. His hand-picked library, which, as I said, was one of the greatest libraries of England and Britain, had over 3,000 volumes, 18th century volumes, on French history, politics, and literature. Thus, in 1782, when he's managing these negotiations, a friendship based first on admiration, then on trust and confidence, grows naturally between him and the Comte de Vergennes, because Vergennes was an extension simply of a whole culture that he had been in conversation with for decades. Several close friends, like Jacques Necker and the Abbé Morellet, were intimately acquainted with the French minister and his undersecretary, Gerard de Reneval, and provided Shelburne with introductions to them. These were men, Shelburne felt, that both could be and should be trusted, even if their countries were at war with one another. But Shelburne wasn't just a Francophile or a compromiser. He does care about outcomes, so the philosophical and the intellectual dimensions of his peacemaking are extremely relevant. And this willingness to compromise I'm talking about is linked to an equally powerful belief in and a desire for cooperation among the civilized nations of Europe. The question of cooperation or competition with France in negotiating a peace is resolved according to the precepts of his cosmopolitanism, an idea at the time that competes with contemporary popular ideologies of patriotism and nationalism. In Shelburne's eyes, the economic and social development, the conversion of natives in America, say, a more sophisticated understanding of the nature of polity, the extension of the principles underlying constitutionalism, to take just 4 of his hopes, all of these serve the end of bringing the Anglo-European community closer together, practically, morally, politically. And it brings the Anglo-European community together, even as it also brings the Anglo-American community together. While separate, Britain and France were also joined. It's a kind of tension with Shelburne, but he's aware of it and plays with it throughout the negotiations. And Shelburne, the peacemaker, would work to both recognize and perpetuate this condition of being separate yet joined. He believes not only in the common interest of the whole empire, which was a phrase he used several times, but also in the whole of Europe. In one of these letters, Vergennes very famously says, "I don't share the old prejudice that there exist natural incompatibilities between our nations, between France and Britain." He says this in 1783, but Shelburne could have said exactly the same thing, and does on many occasions in writing to the French and in writing to many people in Parliament when he's trying to sell this peace to people. Now, Shelburne is driven by the philosophically informed sentiment, this belief system, this imperative, and it's an imperative that argues for a kind of rapprochement, certainly with the States, but even more so with France. Remember, by the fall of 1782, he had already granted them independence, and they'd already won the war. So his concern really was with the future, not with the past, as he kind of puts the final touches on his treaty. The necessity for rapprochement is something that he had been a kind of idée fixe with him ever since he had opened up discussions about the necessity of rapprochement during the 7 Years' War with his commander, James Wolfe. And he's talking and writing about this throughout the 1760s and 70s, but it comes to a real urgency in 1782. The clock is ticking more quickly, I suppose. Shelburne's country is militarily, financially, and morally strapped after 7 years of war. At least Shelburne thought so. It's probably arguable, historians would say, that they probably could have survived a few more years of this struggle. But Shelburne's ministry had only a brief window, not just because of the over macro concern about the economics of the war, but he has a brief window. He has 5 months to get this through or to craft this treaty because of parliamentary concerns. He has 5 months in which to move it through Parliament without the impedance from lesser politicians and special interests because they're on recess. With no natural majority in Parliament and with little interpersonal cohort building skills, he senses an urgency for effecting a rapprochement with the state that he regards as England's greatest friend, not its foe. Such urgency makes it seem necessary to dispatch lesser matters like American independence. In the manuscript and the printed documents that have come down to us, being archived in Paris, London, and States and family descendants' houses, it appears that what Shelburne gave away, or refused to give away to America, was done with an eye to both pushing forward this desired rapprochement with France and affecting France's dealings with other states in Europe. Most of his correspondence, if you take all of the correspondence and put it together, this becomes clear. Amity and balance become the watchwords of his correspondence and his negotiations. Words do have consequences, then as now, and continually he's emphasizing words like concepts like consideration, respect, moderation, and justice. Shelburne and Vergennes as well both strive to preserve the status quo by keeping small states and large states in balance. In particular, they're both of them concerned by keeping Russia and Austria from expanding at the expense of the Turkey and the Crimea. Jonathan referred to this a minute ago, and it's much more important in the overall scheme of things than is ever acknowledged in the American treaty story. Shelburne and Vergennes both deeply believe that a France and Britain that worked together harmoniously could keep the peace in Europe. Okay, so in conclusion, let me just say that when one reads all that someone like Shelburne produces or received in the early 1780s, not just from the Americans, but also the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Russians, the Austrians, the Swiss, and the Swedes. Luckily, they write in French and not in Russian and whatever the other languages were. One discovers the primacy of European considerations in the crafting of British positions and treaties, including the American treaty. In Shelburne's mind, America loomed large, of course, as does the British Empire. But France and Europe were just as large, and I think in Shelburne's mind they were larger. He was on top of what was going on in France as much as he was on top of what was happening in the States. More importantly, in handling the French and the European matters, Shelburne and Vergennes did not engage in a kind of death struggle over opportunities. Instead, through compromise over a range of issues and through the establishment of mutual trust and confidence, the two of them together created and maintained, at least for a few years until the revolution breaks out, an amity among Europe and a balance of powers among the large and small states there. At war's end, the balancing amity among Europeans was just as important to the treaty's several architects as the initial cause of the war and the initial gambit to peace, which was American independence. By 1782, American independence was a given, but the future of a stable Europe was not. Thank you.
Well, that was a remarkable, fresh take on an extraordinary story, and I can't wait to give you all a chance to ask him some questions. The next talk will actually look at the long-term impact of this story on contemporary ways of thinking about diplomacy and intelligence. And we're going to hear about that from the perfect person to do it. Michael Pillsbury, with a PhD from Columbia, educated at Stanford, but really educated as a strategist through doing it in the field. He is, as you'll read in the biography of him, the architect of a doctrine known as the Reagan Doctrine to help supply covert activities in the 1980s. He's been involved in numerous activities of strategy and diplomacy, multiple Senate committees. He continues to be an influential thinker, and I'm very much looking forward to what he has to say. He is a Society of the Cincinnati, so he's directly descended from the men that fought in the American Revolution as officers. And with that, there's not more to be said because he's a spy and he keeps it all secret from me. So please, everybody give a big welcome to Michael Pillsbury.
Thank you very much. In my 15 minutes, I want to try to recruit the audience, and we'll do a show of hands either on the panel or at some point to see if I've succeeded or not. Here's my proposition. The American Revolution, especially the settlement in 1783, Ambassador Oliver, I'm trying to recruit you too, should be seen as a source of lessons today for young officers joining the CIA or the Foreign Service or the military. That's my proposition. Many people oppose this proposition. They say the federal government should not have supported all the research in the last 50 years with the National Endowment of Humanities to try to bring together the papers of George Washington and John Adams and Ben Franklin because it's not related to the federal government's mission. This point of view also says the American Revolution is so yesterday. There can't be any lessons other than very abstract, like be honest and tell the truth, because there were no aircraft carriers, there was no National Security Agency, there was no United Nations, there was no world order in the sense of United Nations Charter, Bretton Woods. So all the key ingredients, this school says, of the world today, the young Foreign Service officers, CIA officers, and military officers will face during their careers, it's so different, there's no reason to learn lessons. And I believed that when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. In the 60s, and I'm looking over here at Professor Jonathan Dole, who I'm going to praise to the skies in a second. In the 60s, as an undergraduate, what we were taught about the American Revolution was quite vague. A lot of the really nitty-gritty that you would need to draw lessons for today's young officers simply were not known. The delicious quotations from John Adams, who says the French are trying to keep us weak and dependent. This had to be found. It wasn't in the Stanford 1966 version of the American Revolution. King George III saying, we really got a good deal, or worse to that effect, after the treaty. That had to be found. In fact, there are still King George III archives that are being opened as we speak. There's a long set of these things that I've compressed down for today because of Ambassador Oliver's orders to me. I'm going to go over 10 moves that happened in 1782. And you tell me if knowing these 10 moves, some taken by Benjamin Franklin and the American delegation in Paris, some taken by the French and some taken by the British, should our young officers know about these 10 moves? And to prejudice you somewhat further, to recruit you, as I said, I want to make sure you know, if you go to the CIA website, cia.gov, you will find the story of the 3 heroes of the American Revolution and why they've had titles given to them as the founder, number 1, the founder of foreign intelligence collection, that's George Washington. Number two, the founder of counterintelligence, and that's John Jay, who chaired something bizarrely called the Committee for the Detection and Destruction of Conspiracies. The records survive, by the way. And number three, the main topic today, is the founder of covert action for the United States, Benjamin Franklin. And just to quote Professor Dole in one of his books, he starts out with the preface saying, "I've spent the last 40 years reading the mail of Benjamin Franklin." And that has paid off handsomely in understanding these 10 episodes. At the same time, the same Professor Dole and others have mined the French archives, the papers of Vergennes, the famous memos, the back and forth, the intelligence reports. Two of my episodes here come from those French archives. The third set of archives, previous speaker, Professor Hancock, he's mining them now, the Shelburne papers. And he said, importantly, Shelburne was the mastermind. I think that's partly true, but when I finish my 10 episodes, I hope to convince you the mastermind, the co-mastermind, was Benjamin Franklin. Episode number 1, 1782. Benjamin Franklin already was friends with some of the most sophisticated and wealthy ladies of Paris. There's a book about it by Professor Lopez. It's actually called Mon Cher Papa, Franklin and the Ladies of Paris. It's not just some sort of outsider book. It's published by Yale University Press. Franklin writes a letter to Shelburne. He says, "I'm thanking you on behalf of Madame Helvetius for the gift you gave her of the gooseberry bushes." This becomes known later as the gooseberry bush ploy. Now, this is when there's been a war for many years. There's no contact. Franklin has instructions from the US, from the Continental Congress. The most important instruction of all, do not deal separately from the French. And apparently in Franklin's mind, this is just a social letter to thank Earl Shelburne for the gooseberry bushes he gave to Madame Helvetius. Move number 2. Shelburne considers what to do with this letter, this communication, which, by the way, is delivered by another famous lady of Paris. So it's totally unofficial. Shelburne sees the opportunity here. He understands, obviously, the chief American delegate, the others have not arrived yet, has just written me a letter. Move number 2, Shelburne picks a 75-year-old Scottish politician, let's say, and sends him to Paris to meet Franklin with instructions which have survived. Clearly, the British goal is to divide the French from the Americans. The follow-up in person on the offer. Third move. Franklin decides not only to meet, this is against his instructions, to meet with the 75-year-old. He hears him out about the generous terms the British will offer, very generous, by the way, and he says, "You know, would you like to meet the French foreign minister?" We can only guess what Oswald was thinking. I'm here on a quasi-secret mission to divide the Americans from the French, and Mr. Franklin here is saying, let's go meet the French foreign minister. He can't send a cable home. I think, Mark, you're here, right? He can't send a cable back to you and say, is it okay? So he goes to see Vergennes. Vergennes now thinks, aha, my loyal American negotiators here are bringing this British probe to me. Everything is going to be okay. This turns out to be underestimating who is the mastermind. Franklin now begins to understand, back in London, there are two secretaries of state, one for the colonies and one for foreign nations. Each wants to negotiate the peace. One is Mr. Fox, who would, in today's parlance we would call a hawk. He's very stingy on the new borders for America. The other is Mr. Oswald, who seems to be even more hawkish on some things, but also clearly has the confidence of the king. Franklin knows this, and he decides he can now choose which channel, because Mr. Fox sends his envoy to Paris. Instructions, signed letter, meet with Franklin. Franklin now knows I need to work this other channel, but he takes this young envoy, Mr. Grenville, also to see Vergennes. So Vergennes is now getting the idea that there are differences back in London, which fits Franklin's agenda. He wants the French to understand the British have options. One of the options that Franklin has already produced forged letters and circulated them 3 years before this story. Franklin is continually playing on the French paranoia that there will be some sort of separate deal. Move number 5. These are pretty much month-to-month stories. Move number 5. Well, because we're in the French embassy, I'm going to skip move number 5.
There's going to be Q&A.
At this point, a number of dilemmas face Franklin, and he decides to engage in what the State Department, CIA, and Defense Department today would call a major security violation. He has what we would today call classified instructions. And he's made a list of the necessary terms that America must have for the peace treaty. And he's made a second list, there's about 5 on that list. He's got a second list of the 5 that are desirable, but clearly not necessary. What do you think Franklin did with Oswald? In those days, there's no copy machines, no email. He shows the instructions to Oswald and lets him make a written copy to take back to London. The British now see, aha, we can go for these first 5, but not the second 5. The British are not finished yet. You remember Admiral de Grasse? I think every speaker today has talked about Admiral de Grasse. As Louise Oliver knows, when the Society of Cincinnati go once a year to Paris to celebrate the victory in Yorktown in October, the Society of Cincinnati delegation always goes first to the statue of Admiral de Grasse. But there's a little-known role Admiral de Grasse plays. It's the next move. Shelbourne frees him from, I think, the Tower of London. He's quite a celebrity already in London because he's a great admiral, and sends him home to Paris. De Grasse gets home. He's got some knowledge of what's going on. He decides to write a memo to Foreign Minister Vergennes, which has survived. He lays out very generous terms. The British, that is Shelbourne, has verbally told de Grasse. So essentially, Vergennes' mind has been affected by multiple channels of information about the terms of the peace treaty. At the same time, I don't want to portray Franklin as knowing everything. We know again from the new documents the last 30 or 40 years, there's a lot the Americans don't know, and it hurts us badly. We don't know the British are tied down so much in India. We don't know some of the squadrons, some of the naval squadrons that Professor Dole has found these records. Sometimes when they're being sent to America, others are being sent to India. There's a trade-off going on. So the Americans don't know about the India card. The Americans, from the materials available up till now, barely understand the British slave trade and the economics of that. The Americans do understand Canada. And Franklin makes a proposal to the British, if you let us have Canada, the tax revenues will be so great from Canada, we'll be able to fund the liabilities that have been incurred by the Loyalists in America. Because the Loyalists is a big political issue back in London, how to treat them, what to do, and so forth. This will actually, as we all know, this will lead to the Constitutional Convention because the treaty calls upon the states to fund these things, if possible, as it were, and they can't. Congress has no taxation authority. So this initiative by Franklin is another one of the steps when he's dangling in front of the British. But as I say, he doesn't know the entire picture. It's not clear Franklin understands, not clear to me, Franklin understands about Crimea and France's goals in what today we would call Eastern Europe. It's not clear whether if Franklin knew more about the French situation and the long-term competitive rivalry between London and Paris, Franklin might in fact have taken additional steps at this point. But actually, this is almost enough, except for one small problem. Now we get to December 1782. People pretty much have the rough idea of the draft peace treaty, not signed. And the French say, let's send a joint Spanish-French fleet at a time now of British weakness. Let's recover the islands in the Caribbean that we need. The fleet is almost about to sail. How was the peace saved? This would be rekindling the war, major war. The Spanish ambassador in Paris, who knows Franklin, on his own authority, agrees on December 16th, 1782, certain terms in the treaty involving Florida, Minorca, stop the fleet, which in fact is stopped. The last move, in many ways the most interesting, is December 15th and December 17th, 1782. Franklin knows, of course, he's been violating his instructions for quite some time. By now, Vergennes must know. So he writes a letter that survived to Vergennes. I think Jonathan Dole found it, saying, I apologize for my lack of etiquette. He uses bienpaisance, I think it is. My lack of etiquette in not keeping you informed. And Vergennes forgives him in a letter that arrives 2 days later. At the same time, Franklin drops a hint. If America drops out of the war now, the British in New York will be freed up to go down to the Caribbean. You almost don't have to finish the sentence for the French to know what that means. So, I tried to recruit you. There are lessons to be learned. We don't have time to go into the covert action lessons, how you set up a front company, how you select weapons that will be useful, how you calculate the geopolitical results, how you can make mistakes in covert action and fund the wrong people. But I would maintain that the CIA is correct in the selection of Benjamin Franklin, not just for these moves, but for his covert action activities that go back earlier. I think they're correct on John Jay, who played a role which is very much like a counterintelligence person in the delegation. I've promised you I would give you the George Washington story in 60 seconds, why he earned the CIA title of the founder of Foreign Intelligence Collection. Does anybody here know about Source 355, also known as Lady? We've all talked about Yorktown. Everybody knows about how the French landed and went to New York and went down to Yorktown and all this marvelous coordination that took place. You think the British were just minding their own business in New York while this was all happening? No. They created a secret plan to go attack Rochambeau's forces just as they were unloading in Newport. A plan to thwart Rochambeau's forces at their most vulnerable moment of landing. George Washington was running a number of spy rings and personally writing letters that have survived about the use of invisible ink, the use of ciphers, collection requirements. Can you try to get this? Can you try a different channel? And in the papers that survive, there's one big gap. Who was source 355? I think CIA should offer an award, and so should the DOD, for the discovery, which is possible, who that was. She was called Lady and apparently had access to high levels of society in New York and somehow learned of the secret plan to thwart Rochambeau. Don't forget, everything depends on these forces coming to Yorktown. George Washington receives the information and in a split second, you might say, decides to mount a deception to attack New York. So the British decide not to go. And the rest is history. So, shall I ask now or wait till later? How many think there might be lessons for young officers to be responsible for studying today from the American Revolution? Put your hand up. All right, how many say it's so yesterday? Thank you very much.
Is that what you wanted?
Yeah, that's right.
Wonderful. That was two thought-provoking, interesting papers, quite distinct. Challenge for the moderator, but not too great of a challenge. We have two different stories here. One, of course, is about the Peace of Paris, the four treaties and the vision behind them and sort of what's going on, the geopolitics of them. And then we have a story about the Treaty of Paris, the American treaty, and how it came to be. So the one question to ask David is, what would you add to the narrative of events that led to the American treaty, which, as you suggest, is for Shelburne is sort of, he already knows independence is going to happen. That's done deal, and he's trying to really get that out of the way. How does that fit into what the Americans know or think they know, and how the French are behaving over that spring and summer of 1782?
Well, I think, I don't quite know how to answer that, but I think, one of the interesting things is I don't think anyone knows how it's going to play out in April and May. I think there's greater confidence on the part of the British than the Americans, largely because they all have all these common friends. Like, Shelburne has a long history that goes back 25 years with Franklin. So the kind of way they communicate is sometimes they would speak in code. I mean, not code, but I mean, sometimes they just would use affectionate terms in their correspondence, and sometimes. So they have a long way of discussing. They were in the same city a lot, and it wasn't just Oswald. There were 3 or 4 people that were already in Paris, that he's been in correspondence with. So there's this kind of confidence, I think, that someone like Shelburne has, that he knows the people that he's confronting. He doesn't quite know what he's going to be confronting with the French, but through a different set of people, much like these ladies, that Franklin is actually all the same ladies because they went to the same salons.
And they both know the ladies. Shelburne also knows them.
But you didn't know the men because the men weren't the intellectual discussion people. These women were the kind of things that brought everyone together. Madame Helvetius was a little past her prime by that point, but she had been sort of a kind of great sort of Celaniste. And so she brought people in and sort of encouraged free discussion. The idea that Franklin wasn't aware of the things that are going on, let's say, with Russia and the port and with Austria, I think would be surprising. I don't know whether Jonathan would know whether he actually writes about the acknowledgments in his letters, but to sort of not go to salons and hear about this as they were talking about it, to sort of not read it in the newspaper, or to be unaware of it because it's in the newspaper, because it's being discussed in salons, I think would be surprising for Franklin to be aware. So, I mean, I think the interesting thing really is that there is this whole group of like shadowy figures, maybe not spies, but shadowy figures like merchants, like kind of lesser gentry who have taken up residence in Paris, who are supplying both sides with information.
It's clear that the Americans don't know, the American ministers that are negotiating they don't really understand the importance of the fear of Russia to the French strategies at that moment. I mean, they don't really have a great sense that the French are ready to move quickly on peace terms, or are they not, because they're waiting for Gibraltar to be decided, or...
Well, again, I would sort of say, I know Jay's work a little better, Lawrence slightly less well. Lawrence is really not part of the discussion at all, because he comes in very much at the end, although he's corresponding with the envoys in Paris a lot. So he's still part of the discussion. These are, Jay has just come from Madrid. Lawrence is in the Netherlands. I mean, these places Netherlands, it's a hotbed for discussion about what's going on in Russia and Austria. Those places are directly affected by being a much smaller state, by the kind of imbalance that would happen. So I do think they're aware of it, whether they write about it to each other, when they write back to, so much of what we know about the American envoys is sort of what they write back to the people in the States. And to them, I would say probably Russia, Austria, and the politics of those places is kind of terra incognita. So there's probably kind of selection that goes on when they write those letters.
You tend to talk about Shelburne as having this narrow window of time to get this done. He doesn't have a strong parliamentary backing. He doesn't seem to have the personality to build one. Ultimately, his ministry will collapse when news of the American treaty is voted, resolutions against it are voted in Parliament. What would have been the outcome of the broader peace if Shelburne wasn't there? I mean, was he the sort of crucial man on the spot to create a peace that could last? Or, I mean, what would have been the alternatives?
It seems to me that the most likely other person would have been Charles James Fox. And the thing that really, ultimately, they had hated each other for 20 years because, in some sense, Shelburne screwed up his father's career, and that's the narrative in the Fox family. And Shelburne's father did not get a title in 1763 the way he wanted to, and Shelburne was the intermediary between Bute and Fox and the king. But it's primarily the big issue that separates them is, when are you going to grant independence to the colonies and acknowledge them as the United States? Shelburne, while he thinks that they will be independent, doesn't think that that should happen until the very end of the peace, the signing of the treaty, and has believed that for some time. And so he kind of has to stick with that line and is forced not to, in a way, by the logic of September of '82. But Fox wants to do it immediately. Fox is a kind of much more radical. I don't think, from what I know of Fox's dealings, with overseas sort of diplomats, he's both as conversant in the kind of political scene of each state, and he doesn't have this kind of he doesn't have these tentacles that reach into the kind of government bureaucracy of each state the way Shelburne does. So when Shelburne speaks through someone to Vergennes, he's got like 8 other people also speaking at the same time to Vergennes. He does the same thing when he's talking to someone in the Netherlands, or when he's talking to someone in the Palatinate, when he's talking to someone in Madrid. And he's been building up that kind of sort of tentacular kind of informational network ever since the late 1750s. Fox, because he's later in his period, he's seen to be a libertine and seen pro-French. He's often thought of as pro-French, but he doesn't have a lot of engagement with France before this. So it's not clear to me he would have been as willing to sort of give up on certain things. He may have actually felt the temper of the Commons more accurately. I mean, the Commons was furious, when they actually saw the terms of the peace. Shelburne knew that he had to conduct it largely in secret. It reminded me of like Hillary Clinton's initial health insurance plan where she tried to do everything in a kind of covert way. And then when it came out, everyone got terribly upset. And this is sort of what happens when he brings it to Parliament and then tries to defend it is, and that by that point then, Fox is kind of siding with North and they want to bring down the Shelburne government.
I mentioned lessons. There's also negative lessons, which I hope you'll cover in your Shelburne. I mean, I'm going to buy your biography anyway, but I hope it covers the degree to which Shelburne actually understood everything versus intelligence failure. This is a big topic now. There's a law. The intelligence community gets things wrong. It has to report it to the intelligence committees, which leads to the discussion of, well, what exactly is an intelligence failure? The classic three, and this applies to 1782, the classic three intelligence failures by the CIA, the first national intelligence estimate in 1950 says the Chinese are not going to intervene to protect North Korea. And about 3 weeks later, 300,000 Chinese intervene. Second example, everyone is taught now, young officers are educated. There's something, believe it or not, called CIA University. They're taught that the national intelligence estimate is sent to President Kennedy saying the Soviets will not deploy missiles to Cuba, and then all the reasons why. Roughly 1 week later, the first missile arrives. The third classic intelligence failure is related almost the same time. President Kennedy is given another esteemed colleagues, national intelligence officers, the best that can be provided to the White House. There's one thing you can know for certain about the Soviets and Cuba. They will not deploy nuclear weapons into Cuba. They don't even share nuclear weapons with their closest allies in Eastern Europe. This cannot happen. And in the intelligence failure study CIA has done, it seems the chronology is given to the president the night after the first Soviet nuclear weapons have been unloaded in Havana. So failure means you say this can't happen. You don't say maybe there are 4 options, but you rule something out and then it happens. That's really bad. And that happens to some degree with all sides, the London, Paris, and whatever you want to say for the Americans, Philadelphia. They misunderstand key facts about the situation.
Well, it strikes me that one lesson from studying history should be humility that comes with recognizing that you don't know everything. I think that David's biography of Shelburne is not going to begin with "I despise this man." He clearly loves him and struggles with him. Let's open it up for some questions. Right?
Well, Britain is not necessarily anti-Russian at this point, but Shelburne is very aware that Vergennes is sensitive to this. And Shelburne had had some dealings at the tail end of his Secretary of Stateship when he was Secretary of State for the Southern Department. So in the last months of his term in 1768, and there was some proposal for a northern coalition involving Russia. And so I think that's what he's actually referring to. And he took a very different position than so let's say the ministry took that succeeded him, and then in the 1770s. I think that's probably what he's referring to.
Okay, but if I'm not, we have to be careful, because Professor Dahl has written on this, and I think that you have one long footnote where you found in Shelburne's papers a proposal involving Russian troops being ferried by England to occupy America, correct? It's a policy option. The Chinese today are translating books by Gordon Wood, Jonathan Dahl. I'm sure one of yours at least, if not both.
Doug Bradburn.
There's quite a fascination in China with the origins of American strategy. When did America first begin to behave strategically? And I've gone to some of the seminars with the Chinese scholars. They have their preferences among American scholars. The Americans who tend toward imperial expansion is the goal of 1783. So there tends to be a Chinese, if you will, demonization of our strategic motives. And I'd address this in my book called The 100-Year Marathon, and a long chapter on how the Chinese perceive us, in part based on their reading of the American Revolution and what you might say, the kind of people we are. But the other lesson is the problem of misperceptions can be quite dangerous in causing war. There's 4 or 5 books now on the causes of war. They have a title like The Causes of War. One's an Australian, one is MIT professor Steve Van Evera. The consensus so far among the scholars is it's not fighting for oil, it's not class warfare. Wars tend to happen because of miscalculations about the balance of power between 2 sides. Intelligence failure of a certain type. So that gives us warning about the South China Sea that you raise. Are we so sure we understand the perceptions of all the players?
And we understand the perceptions of these signals as well. So thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.